Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Warrant Officer Kim Duke. Tomorrow marks the commencement of a new sitting year for the 46th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial to reflect on the political, economic and religious freedoms afforded to us as Australians. These freedoms are underpinned by those who serve and have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells reminds us of what it means to be an Australian. We are committed to one another, our nation and the ideals of mankind. Here with us today are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour, cloaking us, reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of Parliament commence the sitting year, your presence here speaks to every Australian, whether by birth or by choice, of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and our country. We thank you for your commitment and service, which reflects the essence of the Australian spirit, a spirit that we also showcase here in the stories at the Australian War Memorial. Shortly, we will hear the story of Private Percival Eric Gratwick VC, who lost his life while serving Australia in the Second World War. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 46th Parliament of Australia who are joining us this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force, and members of the Australian Defence Force. Mr Glenn Keys, representing the Chairman and Counsel of the Australian War Memorial, and Colonel Susan Newhouse, retired, Member of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those who are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. Australia's Federation Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory.
Catapult party, move! Mighty, press on!
I would now like to invite the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
To my ministerial and parliamentary colleagues who are with us here today, the Leader of the Opposition, the Chief of the Defence Force and the Director of the Australian War Memorial and members of the War Memorial Board. We gather here to honour the past and to prepare ourselves for the future. And here in this our most sacred place, we hear our country. We hear the Ngunnawal people on whose land we gather, and we honour their elders past, present and emerging. We indeed see the uniforms and medals of those amongst us, and behind them are lives that have given themselves to sacrifice and service. And we sense amongst us the 102,000 Australians whose names are on these walls and who gave their tomorrows for our today. And we say thank you for your service. Today, as part of this memorial's daily reminder of stoicism, sacrifice and service at the start of our parliamentary year, we gather not because it's demanded of us, but because we demand it of ourselves. In this sacred place, we stand side by side with each other to lift our vision to our common purpose, to safeguard, protect and defend and advance Australia. Here we draw from the well of times past so that we can better understand our country, our times and ourselves. In this place of memory, we are reminded that nations are defended by those who display physical as well as moral courage. We reflect on this courage during our generation's own time of testing, facing the greatest health and economic challenges of our lifetimes in the midst of unprecedented geopolitical change. But such times are not without precedent in this country. This month, 80 years ago, Singapore fell. Darwin was bombed and both houses of parliament met together behind closed doors to prepare for the unimaginable, an enemy that appeared to be unstoppable. And during that time, our Prime Minister John Curtin spoke a truth that must be a lesson for all time. He said, "Facts are stern things. We, the allied nations, we're ready." So the Australians of those times, military, civilian and political, helped turn the tide of war, and we will be remembered throughout all history. The lessons of those times is readiness. Our honouring of the past must beckon us to prepare for the future and the challenges that we face today. Today, the task of forging and holding a peace and protecting our spirit and vibrant democracy, it remains, and so do the threats. As does the call for duty, service and courage and preparedness. Our democracy is strengthened by the veterans who serve in our parliament, so many of us here with us today. Men and women who understand the consequence of our decisions better than all those who sit in the parliament, and who by their presence challenge us to live lives of moral courage. Today we call to mind the 400 men and women who have served in our armed forces and have also served in our parliament, We remember the service of Major General Harold Edward Pompey Elliott, a Boer War veteran, commander of the 7th Battalion at Gallipoli in the 15th Brigade on the Western Front, and a senator for Victoria. A former Prime Minister, Stanley Bruce, who fought and was wounded at Gallipoli, and who in later life worked so closely with those he fought against. Sir Charles Davidson, the country member for Dawson, who served on the Western Front in the First World War and commanded the 42nd Battalion in New Guinea in the Second World War. David Thompson, the Nationals member for Leichhardt, who served in Borneo, New Guinea and Japan during and following the end of the Second World War, and was awarded the Military Cross for his service in the Korean War, and also served in the Malayan Emergency. And Graham Edwards, the Labor member for Cowan, who lost both legs in Vietnam and who was still a fierce advocate and trusted advocate for veterans. Many of these have been mentors. And one I remember is the wisdom and the strength and the humanity of Sir John Carrick, who I knew well. And I know the Leader of the Opposition can speak of the same spirit of the goodness of Tom Uren. John Carrick and Tom Uren, as we've often remarked upon here at this particular service, faced the worst of humanity at Changi, Hellfire Pass and working the Thai-Burma Railway, yet both rejected hatred and embraced forgiveness in all its forms. I also honour the serving members and senators who have worn the uniform of our country in modern conflicts and operations. Thank you. Thank you for what you bring to our Parliament and our deliberations, and for your devotion to the cause of Australia. Soon the bugle will sound, as it does each and every day here. And today the bugle plays for Private Percy Gratwick. He left school at 16 and served as a messenger in the Western Australian Parliament, and was later a station hand and a stockman. Shortly we will hear his story of a soldier that stepped up in the moment of trial and who made a difference during the battle at hand and those around him. A VC. May we be inspired by his memory and by the memory of all who have sacrificed and served our country, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd now like to invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison and all my parliamentary colleagues, Matt Anderson, the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Glenn Keys, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Chief of the Defence Force, General Angus Campbell, Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnson, Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Mel Hupfeld, Major General Andrew Hocking, representing the Chief of Army, all veterans and serving members of the ADF represented here this evening, and the Ngunnawal people on whose land we are gathered. Is there any silence so profound as the one that falls after the firing of the last gun? However brief that silence is, it marks more than the transition from war to peace. It is a border, a frontier beyond which so many can only travel in the form of memory. For those who have fallen in battle, that silence is the final full stop. And as we gather here, we think of them all. Their names, their faces, their voices. Each one of them was once the bright centre of someone's universe, and so many are mourned still. The minute of silence lets us reflect on the moment the gun stopped, and we imagine all the voices that belong to that silence. Of course, we have other rituals. We listen as the piper plays, the flowers of the forest, a lament for the dead of a battle centuries ago, and we are moved by its austere beauty. And we feel each note of the bugle during the last post, a piece of musical simplicity that holds us like so little else. Just as they touch our hearts, we hope they can somehow touch the spirits of the dead. Yet ultimately, we return to that silence and we think of everyone we have lost, even as humanity keeps confounding the optimism of the old phrase, the war to end all wars. The very act of remembering them is to be a flame holding back the fall of night. But as we mourn those who fell and feel gratitude to all who have served, we also take heart in the spirit that drove them. Long after war had shed the naive sense of adventure it once held for some, Australians have kept rising up against tyranny and against injustice. Here, in this sacred sanctuary of memory, we are surrounded by the machinery of war, each one a reminder of the fragility of peace. The guns, the bombs, a life raft from HMAS Sydney that was meant to bring salvation but didn't. A landing boat that was meant to help deliver victory at Gallipoli but couldn't. A Mitsubishi Zero fighter, the likes of which darkened the skies over Darwin almost 80 years ago. Look about at the dioramas of battlefields, the earth below and the heavens above turned into hellscapes, the sea into a tomb. We think of those who fell, walk through this building and feel their presence all around you. We think of those who came home and those who were changed by what they lived through. They left part of themselves back on the other side of that great silence. Just as we owe a great debt to those who fell, we are indebted to our veterans. They stepped up for us. We must step up for them. Yes, Australians have been extraordinary as warriors and as builders and keepers of the peace, but they are also human. A curious mixture of toughness and sentimentality, in the words of British General and VC recipient Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart. Throughout history, whether on the Western Front or more recently at Kabul Airport, they have carried in their hearts the values that make us as Australians who we are. Values that can never be taken for granted, but must always be defended. I will always turn back to my great mentor and Labor giant, Tom Uren. Tom said of his fellow Australian prisoners of war that they survived because of that simple code. The healthy looked after the sick, the strong looked after the weak, the young looked after the old. And the words of his comrade and Liberal Party legend as well, Sir John Carrick, who during his own time as a POW was struck by the heroism and the humanity of the medics. The common sight was to watch a medical orderly holding in his arms a dying friend. Death was there every day. I've never seen such courage. Two great Australians who encapsulated what is greatest about our national character. Not conquest, not victory, but the fact that our deepest instinct is to respond to the worst of times by being simply our best. Even when things are at their bleakest, Australians ensure that humanity prevails. And because of that, we are assured that we will indeed endure as a people, as a nation, as an idea. That is both the hope and the gratitude that we feel during the silence, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. If able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, attention! Catapult party, present arms.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free, with golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult party, shoulder, arms. Catapult party, order, arms.
The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths of floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection. The Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Senator, the Honourable Zed Seselja, representing the President of the Senate, and the Honourable Andrew Wallace, Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honourable Peter Dutton, Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Brendan O'Connor, Shadow Minister of Defence. The Honourable Andrew Gee, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Shane Newman, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. Mrs. Melissa McIntosh, representing the Minister for Defence Industry. Ms. Meryl Swanson, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force. Mr. John King, President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT branch. And the final reads this evening will be laid by Mr. Glenn Keys, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr. Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Percival Eric Gratwick, VC. Percival Gratwick was born on the 19th of October 1902 in Katanning, Western Australia, one of 8 children born to a local postmaster, Ernest Albert Gratwick, and his wife, Eva Mary. Affectionately known as Percy, he received his early education at Katanning State School and later attended school in Boulder and in Perth. Following the death of his father in 1911, Percy's family fell on hard times, and his mother was forced to raise the large family alone. Percy left school when he was 16 and began working in Perth as a messenger at Parliament House. He later moved to the Pilbara region, where he gained employment as a blacksmith, a drover, and a station hand. He opened his own droving plant, which ultimately failed owing to drought in 1931. Having been forced to abandon his business, Percy began working as a prospector. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, Percy Gratwick quickly joined the rush of men seeking to enlist. But having previously suffered a broken nose, he was rejected. After considerable personal expense to fix his nose, Percy again presented himself for enlistment and was accepted on the 20th of December 1940. At nearly 39 years of age, Private Gratwick proceeded to camp for a period of training. He was made acting Lance Corporal in January 1941 and in April was granted a week's leave. He embarked for active service from Fremantle in early June, travelling as part of a convoy of ships led by the heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. Gratwick arrived in the Middle East in late July and was sent to a staging camp prior to being allocated to a unit. He reverted to the rank of private and in September 1941 was sent to the besieged city of Tobruk, where he joined the ranks of the 2nd 48th Battalion. He spent a few weeks there before most of the Australians were withdrawn and sent to Palestine and Syria for rest and garrison duties. By the middle of 1942, Axis forces had reached El Alamein in Egypt, placing them within range of Alexandria and the Suez Canal. The 9th Division was rushed from Syria to Alamein, where they held the northern sector for over 3 months. Gratwick took part in his first major battle on the 10th of July 1942, when his unit attacked enemy positions at Tel El Isa, which they swiftly captured, along with some 400 prisoners. The Australians spent the remainder of the month fighting off heavy counterattacks until both sides, exhausted and under strength, were brought to a standstill. In October, British and Commonwealth units of the 8th Army made a second attack on enemy positions at El Alamein, bolstered by the arrival of more troops and equipment. In the wake of a heavy artillery barrage, they began their advance on the 23rd of October 1942. Though the infantry was largely successful, the failure of the tanks to follow through forced a redirection of the attack. The Australians would drive northwards to the coast against well-defended enemy positions. On the night of the 25th of October 1942, the 2nd 48th Battalion was involved in an attack on Trig Point 29, where they encountered strong enemy opposition. In attacking, Gratwick's platoon suffered heavy casualties, leaving just 7 men to capture their objectives. With the remainder of the platoon pinned down, Corporal Lindsay and Private Gratwick raced forward to assault the enemy positions. Gratwick, with disregard for his own safety, charged the nearest enemy post and destroyed it with hand grenades, killing an entire mortar crew in the process. He then turned his attention to the second post, from which the heaviest fire had been directed. With rifle and bayonet, Gratwick charged the post under heavy fire. There, he inflicted several more casualties and was within striking distance of his objective when he was killed by a burst of machine gun fire. His comrades quickly moved forward and captured the objective. In January the following year, Private Percy Gratwick was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions at Trig Point 29. His citation noted, "By his brave and determined action, which completely unnerved the enemy, and by his successful reduction of the enemy's strength, Private Gratwick's company was able to move forward and mop up its objective. Private Gratwick's unselfish courage and his gallant and determined efforts against the heaviest of opposition changed a doubtful situation into the successful capture of his company's final offensive." Following his death, Gratwick was buried at El Alamein War Cemetery, where he lies today, beneath the simple inscription, "Rest in the Lord." He was 40 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, amongst almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Percival Eric Gratwick, VC, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Cannonball Party, shoulder, arms.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Cannonball Party, set, arms. Cannonball Party, shoulder, arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Cannonball Party, in words, come. Cannonball Party, quick, arms.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director and staff, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the memorial's development project. We particularly appreciate your visit despite the challenges posed by COVID, and we wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.